first point I'd like to make, this is the first time that the Greater Austin Crime Commission has ever undertaken to do a day-long symposium. And the fact that we were able to get the Strauss Center to collaborate with us on it, and that we could get this many business and law enforcement and academic people to devote this many hours to thinking about some very serious topics, I take as very encouraging. I'm not sure how we're going to go forward or what we will do with it. Some of the ideas will bubble out as I try to summarize what I've heard today. I always enjoy a day when I learn new things. And I've learned a lot of new things today, including things about some of the existing law enforcement agencies that I probably should have known but didn't. But let me go back and hit some highlights for me of what jumps out. First, at the top of our whole purpose, and that's the critical role of law enforcement in a democracy to operate under the law. And efforts to try to enhance that and help it be more effective is right up at the top of the list of things that says you've got a viable, functioning democracy. And what's evident to us, including in our closest neighbor to the south, is that when law enforcement is corrupted or collapses, you get chaos. And we also see it as we visited a lot of the other challenges across the Middle East and others that Congressman McCaul brought up. Immediately here, the illicit narcotics trafficking clearly is at the top of the list of worries. I'd been operating off a media story that there were some 96 cities now in which there were distribution networks from the Mexican cartels. And that figure of 276, Greg, are you still out here somewhere? Did he? 230. Almost triple the number that I thought. Think about the ramifications of that kind of distribution network within this country under the control of 5 competing cartels, and how those networks could be used if we saw the kind of merger in Mexico between terrorists and narcotics dealers that we watched for a long time in Colombia between the M19 guerrillas and the producers of the narcotics. So I take that away as a somber thing to think about and to contemplate. How do we know? How do we worry about? Or I'll come back to that a little bit in what we focus on. But clearly, narcotics is not the only worry. And indeed, the one I've already introduced of terrorism is there. We've been introduced in yet a different dimension to thinking about the threats of cyber security. And then I again got rocked back a little by Adam Hamilton and thinking about health issues, because that had not been on my radar at all. But thinking about the challenges for humans, for animals, for plants that are there, how do we think about that? And how do we incorporate it into, as we try to put together effective strategies to deal not only with the challenges of the country writ large, but the law enforcement in the region. The difference between a failing and a failed state. Somalia is a failed state. Yemen is pretty close to being a failed state. I would put both Afghanistan and Pakistan in the danger zone. Mexico is a deeply troubled state with a huge criminal problem fueled by a vast amount of cash. For me, it's not yet in the category of failing or failed. I would put it in the high-risk category. And I'm going to come back to why I'm particularly worried about that at the end. We hear so much about controlling the border. The immigration bill proposed in 2005, which I thought was a pretty decent try to get at a very serious problem by President Bush. It went nowhere because the cry was you got to first control the borders. My fervent wish would be that those who hold that view, and I don't dispute that it is a major issue for us, we're equally concerned about what flows south from those borders and not just what comes north. And how do we put in place the processes and fund the mechanisms to elevate? I take very seriously the Mexican view that they cannot win this war against the narcotic syndicates unless we can reduce the demand, reduce the flow of cash, and interdict the flow of arms. So very serious challenges that are not being, in my judgment, effectively dealt with. A lot of the things we talked about today, flow of oil to flow of technology to ensure a resurgence of Mexico's ability to produce and export oil as well as meeting their own needs and provide alternatives to drug money for paying for local services. A lot of these issues clearly are not law enforcement. They're diplomatic, they're political. And one of the challenges that I take away is how do we influence the diplomatic and political communities to share our level of concern about these challenges for effective law enforcement. I found Jen Hazen's picture of the concentrations of violence interesting. I've tended to look at just broad numbers. And what I found particularly interesting was the concentration in the cities where it's at its peak in the process. But I noted with sustained alarm how many of those are near our own border and the chance for overflow across the borders that clearly presents. And I come back again to the issue of viable democracy and the concentration of violence and the challenge that puts on a functioning democracy. As I listened and contemplated the cyber security issues, I was drawn to the vast amount of information that's flowing. And we think about it in terms of defending against cyber attacks or our ability to conduct offensive attacks. I went a third step. How do we monitor, how do we understand what's flowing on that vast sea of information in cyberspace? How do we know the uses to recruit prospective terrorists, or its uses to provide command and control for those distribution networks in 230 plus cities in this country? How much is going on there that we're unable to either understand, access, or to put in the hands of people who can make decisions in a timely way? But one thing the Middle East has told us here is that social networks have introduced a whole new factor in activating particularly younger generation, so fluent at it, for participation, hopefully for the good, but maybe not always, in how democracies work. They can be very supportive for our keen interest in law enforcement, or they can be detrimental. How do you suddenly pull out a mob to go break down a chain fence during the middle of occasions for great levity and alcohol consumption? Terrorism and counterterrorism, we've focused on much more fervently now for almost 10 years. But again, the takeaway for me today that particularly caught my attention was the homegrown issue. We know we focus on people trying to come into this country. And again, I'll come back at my conclusion to one that particularly worries me in that case. But how do we get a better handle on the homegrown? Being recruited not at the mosque, but on the internet in the process. And by listening to sermons and various recordings on the internet, not becoming visible as they might be if they were in fact going to listen to a clearly identifiable radical imam trying to recruit people to jihad. You'll have already detected, and I come back, a particular worry about criminal and terrorist interaction. Having watched M19 guerrillas and the producers of so much of the cocaine in Colombia, and the huge problem that presented for so many years till Aribi finally dealt with it pretty effectively, with a lot of help from the US. I worry about the cartels becoming a device that offers the prospect of facilitating the flow of potential terrorists into the country. That would be much harder for us to detect. If they can flow and support this network of distribution in 230 cities, if they went into collaboration, their ability to infiltrate people clearly would exceed what we've seen by the nation state. These obviously were notes scribbled as I listened throughout the day. Bobby Chesney, I was particularly struck by the separation of state and non-state actors. And again, it brings me back closest to us to the cartel families. But there are other non-state actors out there as well, particularly in the whole terrorist sphere. And it's the absence of legal frameworks. I had the privilege back in the 70s of participating in creating the FISA court, the Classified Information Procedures Act, other ways to let law enforcement and intelligence deal with challenges within the law. And that's a theme I come back to. Our focus here is on doing what we believe needs to be done within the law, upholding the law. And where there are gaps, how can we go about supporting legislation to close those gaps? I think back now how wise it would have been when the first prisoners were taken out in Afghanistan to have created laws for dealing with what we came to call non-combatants, for non-state actors, terrorists who did not belong specifically to a state. We would not have had this long running debate about what to do with them once we got them to Guantanamo. And how can you apply? So a move to do legislation to deal with that problem in the 2003, 2004 timeframe would have put us in far better condition in dealing with the rest of the world and challenges that we may have out in front of us. So I'd like to see us think further on these non-state actors in here. Is there legislation that we ought to help push, which would make some of these problems easier to deal with? And the overlap that comes up again and again to me is between national security and criminal issues. It isn't either or, it's both. But they are frequently at their most troubling when they do come together as a challenge. Thinking ahead, the global complexities of these problems. We are seized here locally because we've become steadily more alarmed by the violence we've seen in Mexico and the fear that that was going to overflow, and seeing its ramifications with drug distribution gangs operating out of Austin. Now today, yet another one that I had not focused on, the arms organizations here to flow south, the arms that fuel this conflict. As I think out ahead of the challenges, we've got an election in Mexico, 20 months out, July 2012. President Calderon won by 40,000 votes. And that largely was because the pre-candidate sort of imploded during the campaign. Hugo Chavez poured vast sums of money into Lopez Obrador's campaign, and it came very close. Think what we would be dealing with had that been the outcome in the election in 2006. So as you look forward, I thought President Calderon took some very courageous decisions very early to bring in recognizing the vast corruption across the law enforcement community, to try by introducing the Army to maintain control and essential elements to support democracy. Will his successor have the same dedication to attack these problems? And what does that foresee for us? How do we think through worst case? That if the election takes a different direction and that we end up with a new president who is not interested in close collaboration with the U.S. in trying to solve the problems. What are the implications for us as we've talked repeatedly today about collaboration, currently in many ways working well? What are the implications if we get a very different outcome out of the July 2012, December 2012 inauguration? And hovering here for me is Venezuela. We know Chavez bears ill for us and looks for opportunities to implement that ill will. The recent meeting of bringing in Hezbollah and Hamas and others and Iranian influences. I'd worried about the tri-border area down of Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil, essentially lawless for many of these issues. But Venezuela is much closer. And any kind of tie that links in, particularly with the cartels, could dramatically escalate the risk for us for the infiltration of terrorists into this country. So let me sort of pull these loose pieces together by simply underlying multiple threats, terrorism, cyber, drugs. To have any chance of dealing with all of those, we have to have the most effective law enforcement that we can have. And law enforcement to be successful needs rapid access to all relevant information, wherever it's produced, and to be able to digest it and to act on it in very short time frames for that's operational, but also to understand and get focused for future challenges, future threats, which have not yet materialized. And to be effective, they need clarity of the legal boundaries. What can they do? What can they not do? How can we help change those boundaries if they are factors that limit overall effectiveness? And to get that, how do we generate and sustain public support to deal with these threats and challenges? Who are the audiences that we need to influence? And that leads me to my final comment. I look out and I view all of you, whatever position you occupy. You are influencers. And I would challenge you to think about, how do we take what you've heard today, what you've learned today, how do we refine it better to be more useful to you? To influence, whether it's the political specter or the public sector, to help us get ready now to deal with potentially even more serious challenges out in front of you. Thank you very much. I don't, I'll stand around if anybody wants to ask any questions or talk, but I think we've subjected you to a lot. I hope you found it as instructive as I have, and you can help us think through where do we go next. Thank you all for coming.